responded to Fat German Bastard, henceforth to be known as FGB from now on, until now, but a comment in my comment section on the ontological argument stirred me to re-explain what the ontological argument is actually stating, for there has been some confusion in the matter. Now for those curious, the ontological argument will be in the description. Now before I begin, it is very important that I define terms so the following content is clear. It is possible that I did not do a good enough job in this matter, and if that is true, I am genuinely sorry. So let's quickly define the key terms in this argument. There are two. The first is a maximally great being. A maximally great being is the greatest conceivable being. This includes such qualities as omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, necessity, and moral perfection. Such a being has two types of properties, essential properties and non-essential properties. Non-essential properties are properties that can be changed without affecting the essence of the being in question. So for example, relational predicates such as preserver or ruler are non-essential properties of God. Essential properties are properties that cannot be changed or lost without altering the being. For example, omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and necessity. A being who lacks essential properties is not by definition a maximally great being. Second term, possible world. Possible world does not refer to a planet or a universe, but rather possible world is a description of what reality might be or the way the real world could have been. For example, in the actual world, Clinton won the presidential election of 1992. However, in a possible world, it could have been the case that Clinton did not. Moreover, possible worlds have an indispensable condition that they must meet, that being logical possibility. In other words, there is no possible world that contains the proposition 3 plus 3 equals 9. Now, with these two key terms defined, let us move on to the three main statements by FGB. The first statement is in regards to premise 1 of the ontological argument, which states it is possible that a maximally great being exists. FGB writes, I agree that this first premise actually makes sense, because all it says is that the existence of a maximally great being is something we cannot logically rule out as a possibility, end quote. FGB's first problem, and one that will be carried through to the next two premises, is that FGB misunderstands what premise 1 is actually stating. He believes that the word possible indicates epistemic truth value of the proposition God exists, meaning that FGB reads the first premise as God may or may not exist. However, in actuality, what premise 1 is stating is not the warrant or the justification of the truth value of the proposition God exists, but rather is stating the coherence of the concept of a maximally great being, i.e. metaphysical possibility. So in other words, when we read premise 1, it should be read like this. A maximally great being is a coherent and mentally exemplifiable idea, i.e. metaphysical possibility. If you accept the concept that a maximally great being is a coherent concept, then you continue with the syllogism. If you reject the coherence of a maximally great being, then you do not move on with the syllogism. This is why the ontological argument is an argument based on the necessity of God's existence. That is, God exists necessarily because of the coherence of his very nature. Now, since this is such an important point, let me craft an illustration. Consider a difficult math equation that describes gravitational pull. Suppose that this equation is beyond your ability to comprehend. Now suppose further that you grant that it's possible that the equation could be true, but that it's also possible that it could be false. In regards to the math equation, you'd be admitting your epistemic uncertainty as to the warrant of the equation being true, not the actual metaphysical coherence of the equation. This also applies to the ontological argument. Epistemic uncertainty, it could be true, it could not be true, does nothing to change the reality of whether the premise is metaphysically possible. This error is unfortunate, but I don't believe that FGB mistake is uncommon. In truth, this was the way I thought the ontological argument was supposed to be read the first time I examined it. Actually, the first time I saw the ontological argument, I laughed. So it is good that the confusion came up so that it can be clarified. Now, in regards to premise 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. FGB says, quote, "This is true, but you need to keep in mind that the statement, a maximally great being exists in some possible world, is equal to the statement, like maximally great being possibly exists in some world. Because existence in a possible world is actually possible existence in a world. This is the same thing," end quote. Again, the problem here is with the understanding of the word possible. When premise 2 states a maximally great being exists in some possible world, we need to remember our definitions. A possible world is a description of what reality might be, or a way the real world could have been, and is a tool of philosophy which is used to examine claims and worldviews. Now, FGB's modification of premise 2 is actually not equal to the original premise for the following two reasons. One, a maximally great being has numerous essential properties, example, omnipotence, omniscience, necessity, that make the being a maximally great being. Without them, the being would not be maximally great. Thus, a maximally great being that does not necessarily exist in some possible world is not by definition a maximally great. More on this in a moment. 2. The modified premise focuses on the epistemic possibility instead of the metaphysical possibility, as was the case in reading premise 1. Remember, we are not speaking of warrant, but of coherence. Thus, FGB's last statement, now I think the weak point of the argument is premise 3, the fact that God possibly exists in one world does not imply that God necessarily exists in every possible world, confuses contingent and necessary beings. The philosophical tool of possible world allows for contingent and necessary truths and beings. Contingent truths and beings, example, the U.S. entered World War I in 1912, or human beings, exist in some possible world, but not all. In comparison, necessary truths and beings, example, an object cannot be both round and square at the same time in the same sense, and a maximally great being must exist necessarily in all possible worlds. Moreover, a maximally great being is one that cannot be surpassed by any other being. For example, if you were thinking of a being that has all the attributes attributed to a maximally great being, save omnipotence, then this being is not a maximally great being, for we can conceive of one with omnipotence, or consider a being that has a contingent existence. This being also would not be a maximally great being, for necessary existence is an essential property of a maximally great being. Thus, 1, if a maximally great being is a coherent concept, and 2, if a maximally great being can reside in the philosophical notion of a possible world, then 3, a maximally great being that contains contingent existence is either A, not a maximally great being, or B, is a contradiction, i.e., a necessary being that is contingent. Thus, the ontological argument still follows logically from essential properties of a maximally great being and the logical possibility of possible worlds.